I think that Gregor Larson might be the most prolific scientist studying dogs and cats I've ever encountered. I read these articles, people send me articles from all over the place, and each one is like Gregor Larson. I'm like, oh, I'd like to talk to him about that cat study. There's another one. Oh, wait, is that a different cat study? Not to mention the 5 dog studies. Gregor Larson, there you are at Oxford University, and there's nothing British about you. So can you just start by explaining what's a nice American doing in a fabulous British university?
There's a little bit British about me. I have a British passport,
Oh,
and I've
wow, that's
actually
very cool.
and I've lived in England for longer than I lived in the States. So my accent
Oh,
belies my Americanness.
I
But
actually like that. My oldest, dearest friend in the world, Daphne, she was American and became British and has had a British husband and 3 British children. And she always just sounded just like she always sounded.
yeah.
Is it hard to not have picked up the British accent or easy?
There are people, didn't Madonna pick up an English accent for a little
Oh,
while?
so many people do. My mother would go to London, and after half an hour, she'd be, hello, how are you?
And I've seen people go both ways. I use a lot of English terminology, but that's because
Right.
you code switch with the audience that you're in. But the way the words come out of my mouth doesn't change. I don't know why that is. I feel like if I ever tried to put on an accent or mimic what I was hearing, people would I no, the authenticity would just die a quick
Right.
death, and that
I
would never.
can feel that. There's something so quintessentially Jimmy Stewart American about the way you talk. I love it. It's like there's no artifice. It's just mom and apple pie. But the work you do is really esoteric and really far ranging. And are you considered a biologist, an ethologist, an archaeologist? I think archaeologist is your number one, isn't it?
Not really. There's a thing in biology called frequency dependent selection, which means
Wow.
depending on the proportion of the people in the room is what determines what I then ascribe myself as. So if there is a whole lot of archaeologists, I'm a geneticist, and if there's a whole lot of geneticists, I'm an archaeologist
I love it.
because otherwise I'm a bit of a charlatan. I dabble in lots of things, and I have a kind of what I'd like to think is I've an overarching perspective on things, but I have very little in the way of an actual skill set or training for that matter. So if the actual archaeologist and the actual geneticist would probably, if somebody said, "Oh, is Gregor a geneticist?" They'd be, not so much. And the archaeologist would, "Are you absolutely not? He is absolutely not an archaeologist."
The humility is mind-boggling. Your name has been on such, it really is. The number of peer-reviewed fancy journal articles in which your name is part of it is not just coincidence.
We've
What
had a
about
good run, but it's born of the fact that what we do is necessarily interdisciplinary, and that requires big teams. And if I'm good at anything, I feel like I can pull people who have levels of expertise that I can only dream of together onto
oh,
the same
nice.
study and into the same room, and then we produce something fun.
Well, fun is definitely the word. And I feel that even though it's all written in very dry, academic, correct terminology, there seems to be a joyfulness about it. So you're a Renaissance man.
Oh,
A
I
master
would
of
not go
many
that far.
trades. Okay, never mind. I'm just saying, to your average human, you have a brain that can encompass a lot of ideas. So this idea of cats, where they joined the human race, I think, I'm a little tired of the dog story. They were wolves, or maybe they weren't wolves, and they ate our refuse, and then they helped us hunt. Why would they help us hunt? I have no idea. They didn't need us to hunt, but I guess they liked our bones, our refuse, maybe, or warm fire. But that dog story is a tired one. But the cats, no one's ever quite figured that one out. When and where and how did they decide that we were of value to them? So, what is it that you and your amazing teams found out?
So the crazy thing about domestic animals, I'm sure this pertains to lots of different things, but certainly with domestic animals, I think a feature is that because they are so familiar to us, and especially the ones with whom we share our lives, that intimacy makes us feel that we understand them. And then when we tell stories about their origins, it's like anything else. We mythologize, and
Right.
therefore we hang on to those origin stories and those myths without really interrogating them because we of course we know, we just know where the cat sleeps on your bed every night, or as it does on my dad's head. You are just completely aware that the story is that 10,000 years ago in the Near East, people were settling down and it's starting agriculturally based lifestyles, and that meant
Right.
more sedentary, and they were producing a lot of grain, more grain than they could consume at any one time. So they create grain storage pits. Those grain storage pits act as a magnet for the mice and the rodents. And then the
Right.
cats that are there, the wild cats, see this large collection of rodents. They're like, that seems fun. And so then they come along, and that's what unites the cats to the people.
Right.
It's this lovely narrative that kind of has a feel of a Freakonomics story where there's the unintended consequence element of it. It also triggers that idea that cats are only, in very heavy air quotes, semi-domesticated, or that they're not attracted to us as people as dogs are, but they are attracted to the space that we create, and therefore they can be aloof because they know we're just going to feed them the whole time. So that fits our way of thinking about cats, certainly within the context of dogs and with other domestic animals as well, is that cats frankly don't give a shit, and we appreciate that.
That is so well put, because that origin myth story fits the idea that the cats don't really need much from us. We don't really have to do much for them if they're going to be house cats. We don't have to do the stuff that now the serious cat behaviorists say. We got to do an awful lot to make their life not be boring and irritating and depressing and lonely. In England, you know this, that you cannot adopt a cat without promising to let it be outside at least some of the time. In America, it's just the opposite. You can't adopt this cat unless you promise to never let it out.
Huh.
And in both cases, many cats are miserable unless they get out somewhat, even if a coyote eats them, a car hits them, a dog mauls them, or what have you, which they
Mm.
obviously don't see coming. And other cats are perfectly happy, certainly the ones bred by humans, to
Oh, and
stay
that's the other
indoors.
thing, is that there is a huge discrepancy or variability, should I say, within behavioral norms within cats. And that's just within the cats who hang out with us, which is to say nothing of the huge variability in those same kind of characteristics within wild populations. And so what we tend to do also is we say cat singular and dog singular, or
Right.
worse than that. Like I have a book of dog breeds, and it uses the singular whenever it describes a golden retriever is a great family pet. It doesn't say some are and some aren't. It just says
Great
golden
point.
retriever.
Yes, you're so
And that reification or the kind of erasing of that variability really does a disservice to exactly what you just described, where you said some cats are perfectly fine being inside, others are scratching at the walls going, get me out of
yes.
here. And we tend to know that, but then immediately dismiss it.
It's a really great point. It's like a boy child.
Yeah.
Like there's only one kind of boy child at
Yeah,
any age.
exactly. Or there's only one kind of middle child. That's my other favorite.
Oh, that's a good one. Oh, you're a middle child. That explains a lot.
I'm not. I'm one of only two, and
No, what I mean is when people say that,
yes,
they say
exactly.
it as if it means something, and it means exactly nothing.
Yeah,
So
but
now
they're
we
fun
have,
categories, and that's the other thing that we're very good at, right? We love categorizing things and then making that everything within that completely fixed and different from the things in the other boxes. We don't really do well with variation in within.
and yet you professionally, as you said, are really good about stitching together a quilt of many ideas and many narratives and many stories and many historical events or discoveries, archaeological ones in particular, yes,
I
and
feel like
seeing
what
a
we're good at
pattern.
is what we do. It's actually relatively simple, and I'm still surprised that it's not done more, but I understand why not. So, what happens very often, if you're writing a paper about cats, you'll be writing some aspect about them. Not a whole lot of people address the kind of the big origins and things because they're big questions and they're not easy to answer, and you need lots of different kinds of lines of evidence and things. But there are tons, hundreds of studies of dogs and cats and humans and a million other things that look at one particular aspect, either a genetic pathway or a coat color variant or something. But every one of those papers that is written about some aspect of some animal, the opening paragraph will have some introduction, and the introduction is almost always this is where they came from. So you reiterate and reify the origin mythology just in that first opening paragraph. But that means because it's just a stepping stone to get to the rest of the paper, you're approaching the reader going, hey, I'm going to tell you a story about cats. Cats were domesticated this period of time in this place. Anyway, so here's what I'm really going to tell you about. So you
Right,
don't,
right.
what that means though is very few people ever interrogate that opening paragraph. It's really just there to get the reader into the paper, which means that the same two or three studies that ever addressed it are the ones that get cited over and over again, never qualified, never questioned, never interrogated. And then what we started doing, and I was just as guilty of this, by the way. I have this great story there's the story about rabbits and how the Pope in 600 AD made this papal decree saying that rabbits you could eat them during Lent and they weren't considered meat. And so I saw an academic give this talk where he opened a talk about rabbits with that story, and I bought it hook, line, and sinker. So much so that we developed a research project around that concept. And then I was working with a master's student, and I said, let's just, for the sake of crossing the T's and dotting the I's, let's find that papal decree. I just want to be able to reference it. I want to read it. I just want to see precisely what it says, because I've seen it referenced, but I don't know what's really there. 3 weeks later, he comes back and goes, "Yeah, Gregor, we got a problem. There is no such thing." I was like, "Wait, it's not in the library. We couldn't get a copy of it. We like interlibrary loan. We couldn't." And he's like, "No, it doesn't exist. It's been invented." And what he
Wow.
was able to do was put together the entire sequence of a retelling of a story with a mild embellishment that happened about 15 or 20 times over the course of several decades within the academic literature to invent the narrative about how rabbits were domesticated. And what I realized, and again, I was the one the whole time questioning things and priding myself as I'm the only one
Right,
asking questions around here.
right,
And
right.
what did I do? I just was like, oh yeah, that sounds amazing.
Yeah, that's amazing. A pope can say something isn't meat and it is, and this just shows us how
And
quirky
all
humans
I wanted was the reference, but I didn't question the story. And that was really embarrassing for me because I just thought, oh my God, I'm falling for the same hokum as everybody else.
it should be illuminating, not embarrassing. I think it's a great story, and I think there are some stories, some myths that sound really intriguing because that story seems to be more about papal power, the power of an authority to say the sky is not blue.
And again, it has that same Freakonomics element, which is that the rabbits only came in because monasteries in France realized that they could grab them, throw them into hutches, and eat them during Lent because everybody wants some meat over a long period of time when you're not allowed it. But suddenly they're not considered meat anymore because the Pope said so. So that is the only thing. Otherwise, rabbits were just going to be doing what they're doing. But it took that kind of cultural shift and categorization shift in order to bring them into human circumstance. Now, none of this is true, but it made for, again, it's like something with the cats. It made that story just true enough that it fit within an understanding that we believed it to be true because it gave us a detail for something we already knew or felt what we knew.
So,
And
what
so it
is
turns out
that
it's not.
myth that was kept alive and that you guys poked holes in?
What, within the rabbits or the cats?
Cats.
Within the cats. And this is great because what we keep doing is we keep poking holes in animals and then but it's one thing to tear down a story, it's another thing to build it back up again. And
Okay.
that's what's been really fun about the cats. And the irony for me with the cats is that though we are jettisoning or at least seriously questioning, shall we say, you don't want to be too overly confident about these things.
Right.
And the major question for me about the settled agriculture, large grain storage, mice, rat, cat scenario
Hmm.
is that if that's happening at 9,000 years ago, and the evidence for that is a buried cat on the island of Cyprus with some people, which is compelling, that if that kicks off the cat domestication thing, then they should be lousy within the archaeological record. You should be able to see them in the same way that you see dogs, in the same way that you see
Yeah.
the other domestic animals. They should be there. And there's plenty of archaeological records where people have collected the bones, identified what percentage each species is through space and time across this whole thing. And if you do that for about 5,000 years after the one Cypress cat, there's nothing. There's bubkis. There are zero cats. They just
No kidding.
so you have to then start making up stories for why you're not seeing them. But if you're seeing everything else, it starts to be like maybe it's not they don't preserve well, or it's a top predator, so there's very few of them, or whatever excuse you want to come up with, which again
Right.
are valid excuses. But the problem starts to become if you go 5,000 years without seeing one, maybe it's not because they're there and they're missing. Maybe they're just not there. So
Wow.
so what's really fun, and this is the irony for me, is that when I was growing up, everybody said, "Oh, cats are from Egypt," and
That's
now.
right. Which is, I
Yeah.
thought they were deified and mummified, and they were made into statues by tombs.
And all of that is absolutely true. But here's how it links to the cat story, which is fun, is that
Okay.
so there is a goddess, Bastet, Bastet, so
That's
Bastet
right.
or Best, depending on how. And for a long period of time, she is represented with a human body and a lion head. And
Okay.
there are temples and people make long pilgrimages, and there's a shift that happens about 4,500 years ago, 4,000 years ago, in that kind of general time frame, where she starts being represented not in the same body shape, but instead of a lion head, it becomes what you and I would recognize like that looks like a cat head, like a kind of a domestic cat head, or at least a kind of Felis
Right.
libica cat head, like kind of North African wild cat, the progenitor of
Yeah.
the domestic cats.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you have people making very long pilgrimages to get to these temples that are along the Nile. And when they get there, they have to pay homage and they have to pay respect. And the way that you do that is by presenting her with a mummified cat. Now,
Really? This is
yes.
four and a
And
half thousand years ago. This is what you brought?
So this has been known. This has just been happening, and
Well, I
it's so.
didn't know this. I'm not
Oh yeah.
saying you're telling me something I don't know. I think the audience may not know this either. That you
Oh,
pay homage by bringing a dead mummified cat with you.
So here's the ticket, right? If you now go to a church and you want to pay homage to a loved one, a relative or something,
Right.
and very often my experience with this is that you can buy a candle for a
That's
dollar or
right.
two and you can put it up front in memory of the person. You don't
Correct.
bring your own candle. That's not a thing.
That's right. That's right.
You buy one there. And that's just a candle. That's easy enough to put in your pocket. And yet we still don't do that because you're helping out the church or you just, it's
Right.
maintenance to bring your own
It's
candle.
the right thing
So
to do.
imagine if the requirement was not a candle, but was a mummified cat. So not only do you need the cat you first to be alive, then you need the dead cat, then you have to go through the whole mummification process
Wow.
and wrap it all up and then present it. So what this demands, and of course you're going to get one when you're there. Now you need to supply that demand because if a lot of people are coming from a
Wow.
long way, everybody wants a dead cat that has been mummified to present as homage.
Wow. I feel where we're going with this tourism.
So there's a couple interesting things that happen. One is that when something is mummified, however much it looks like it's modeled on a cat skeleton, it's made into a cat head, but that's all kind of the wrappings,
Correct.
not actually taking on the shape of what's inside. So it's a coffin or a shape that looks like a cat that's supposed to have a cat inside. That's the whole point. And
Right.
yet, and this will not surprise you, there was a study about 10 years ago where they x-rayed hundreds of these things. And there is a non-zero percentage, I think something like 10 or 15%, which had nothing in them, and another 20% which had totally different animals.
No kidding.
So you can imagine arriving at this place. You've gone this long distance. You're there. This is a hugely important, maybe like once in a lifetime or a couple. It's like the Hajj,
Right.
basically. Like it's a
Right.
huge deal. And you show up, and there's a guy going. You see all the vendors with the
Oh,
cats,
a
and there's
mummy.
one guy. Yeah, yeah, and one guy then taps you on the shoulder. Is like, "Hey, you looking for a cat?" And you're like, "Yeah." And he's like, "I got one right here." And you're like, "Oh wait, is that legit? Or is there definitely a cat inside?" "Oh yeah, I can guarantee you there's definitely a cat inside this one." Like it's just, but I'll give you 20% off. It's like, oh, okay, and then it's completely empty. But so
I
there's a
love
whole black market of this stuff. And here's the other crazy stat: is that the those temples needed a because once you put the candle there, somebody's got to come through at the end of the day and
and
clean
clean
up.
it up.
Same thing. Now imagine it's a mummified cat. There has to be a massive cleanup, and what do you do with all these? So they create these massive sarcophaguses into which they just toss one after another. And
Oh
there
my.
was so much in there that when English archaeologists went in the early 20th century, they recognized all of it, and it was the volume is just mind-boggling. So much so that some significant proportion of all the fertilizer that was used in the UK in the 20s and 30s in the UK was actually just mummified cat remains, which had been there for several thousand years, rotting away in these sarcophaguses. And that's what was fertilizing soil in the UK. That's how many. So the huge amounts.
So they brought them home on a boat
They
to
brought the fertilizer back on the boat, yeah, from the sarcophagus.
not calling it fertilizer, thinking they were
It
making
was that.
treasure.
That's why they were doing it because they recognized the sort of they knew what it was. But if you leave a dead animal plus some wrapping for a very long period of time, it's going to turn into really great fertilizer. And I think they recognized it as such and then brought it back to do.
That's a whole nother question
Yeah,
because the British love to have trophies, whether it's
sure.
the Elgin marbles and
Yeah.
take everything off the Acropolis. I'm surprised they didn't want to put all of them into maybe there wasn't a British museum at the time, but interesting that they needed fertilizer so badly, or they had so many cat mummies that it was no longer of interest to put in a museum.
The
Of
thing
course,
is,
they weren't cat mummies.
exactly, and they've been eroded. Some of them still exist, and there's lots of different museums have really good examples of them. But when you have millions of them and they have been degrading for several thousand years, then they're not even recognizable as a cat mummy anymore. But you
and
just knew that they were there.
and was
And
fertilizer in such short supply in England?
that's a really good question. Or was it just opportunity because it was easy to get back and it was a very good source of it? It's just, but I think for me, I should definitely look into the detail of that. But for me, what's amazing then is just how many cats you would need to produce
Yes.
that much to then ship it all back as fertilizer several thousand years. So what does that mean? And this is where we get into a little bit more of the realm of speculation here, but it's not completely out of the question. What that probably means is that if you have to supply that much demand, you can't just go into the deserts or along the Mediterranean portion of Egypt and North Africa generally, because the cat population, again, they're top predators, and wild cats, these wild Felis libicas, are not, they don't like each other. They're territorial, and they seek out mates obviously for reproduction, but they,
Right.
generally speaking, do not do well with many more what we call conspecifics around them. They're agoraphobic. And they're just like, no, we don't want anybody else. So you could, and there's not very many of them on the landscape either. So you, to get that many, the story is that what they did was there's an island in the Nile. They
Okay.
would bring cats in and effectively force them to reproduce in close proximity to each other, rapidly changing a behavior, and feed a lot of them as well because you have to keep growing them. So they're creating like these cat farms, but only for the purpose of turning them into mummies. So it's like it's a cat murder pathway, a wild cat murder pathway.
Wow.
But what that does is it puts such a huge selection on that population because in order to mate in close proximity with other cats, which you really don't want to do, you are picking at the very extreme end of a cat behavior, which then also lends itself to being in close proximity to us. So then you get over this behavioral hump where otherwise they would be running away from us and completely not interested in being anywhere near a built human civilized environment. But once you force them to do this with each other, now they're capable of doing it with us. And then they're, as everybody knows from growing up, you see them in tons of iconography. They're in all the paintings underneath the chairs,
Yeah.
eating fish.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
once they become integrated into human societies in that level, then we start moving. And the Egyptians and everybody else around the Mediterranean are moving. The Phoenicians and then the cats are just going with them. I don't think that they're necessarily going with them as like what everybody wants to believe is that, oh, they're great mousers or ratters on the fish on the boats and
Right.
things. I think instead they occupy a very important role here. And when you go with you, when you travel with things, you don't take unimportant things with you. You're taking important stuff that's representative of your culture and of your understanding of the world and how and the things that matter most in that.
Yeah.
And that's so cats are hitchhiking on the entire way in which they become associated with this very important goddess in Egypt. And then the murder makes them more easily able to tolerate us, and then they get established within us, and then they just start moving from there. And then it's the Romans who just go whoosh, and then it's the Romans really push them all the way through Europe, Northern Europe, and then all the way up into Scandinavia.
Wow. That is the most amazing, turn it on its ear story about where cats began in their journey with humans. And it's faintly horrifying that there
Oh,
was
without
the
question.
cat farming and then these mummy hawkers.
Yeah.
And it's just someone who is a clever historical fiction writer. What an amazing setting for a novel. Just the relationships of people and each other and the cats and the killing of them and the mummifying, and then they aren't really cats. And what's in there? Rats? What are the other animals that were ubiquitous at the
Oh.
time or nothing?
Oh no, there was a lot of mummification. There was, Egyptians were just they had lots of relationships with lots of different animals, and their tombs are filled with all kinds of crazy stuff too.
And now we know that it isn't necessarily for the reasons that we thought.
Right.
We like to think, oh, whether it's the Romans and the necropolis or the Egyptians and their tombs, oh, they worshiped cats. They loved them. They cared so much about them. It was so important to them. Or they just knew that if you took a bunch of mummies with you, things would go better in the afterlife. And you could get some down the street from Simon the mummy hawker.
Yeah, and you had to have one to pay homage to the
Yes,
goddess for whom you were making this huge effort to go and pay homage to because she occupied such an important role within Egyptian society. So there's a good friend and colleague who's an amazing researcher, Mindy Zeter, who's been working on domestication for a very long time and is just a giant brain. And she, about 10, 15 years ago, came up with this, which she called three different pathways to domestication. So rather than all being in the same kind of general,
right.
we went and did this, there, so she says there's a kind of a commensal pathway where the animals are attracted to us and so what we're doing, and they come in more or less on their own, and then there's a relationship that gets started. There's a prey pathway that she calls it. We're already hunting them, and then we
Right.
control them more closely. And then
Interesting.
she has this other one called a directed pathway, which is where once you have all these animals, maybe you then like, oh, let's go. We can now farm salmon in a way because we're doing with other things. What she doesn't mention, what I cats fit in that with a slightly commensal, but the twist on this is which I like to call, it's like the murder pathway, right? It's
I
just,
love it. I love it.
it's
Gregor
more fun,
Larson,
right?
this is the most amazing conversation I've had in a long time. I hope
I
everybody
doubt
could
that.
follow along with us because it's all over the place, but it's very central to cats and humans and history and the kind of heathens that we are and always have been. I think it's divine. And I can't wait for you to come back on and discuss some of the many other things about which you are the orchestra, the sort of orchestra conductor, if you want to look at it that way. You're a great conductor of other great minds that have to do with animals, and it's such a pleasure to finally meet you. And I'm not going to let you go easily. We want to have you back to discuss more amazing things.
I would love nothing more, Tracy. This has been amazing.
It'd be